Welcome to the NBA Slate Breakdown. I'm Jason Gilbo at JGilbo11, running through tonight's 7 games on DraftKings and FanDuel. Given the glimpse of position by position, that really we have a pretty good slate here where 3, 4, 5 superstars. You got a couple double-digit price guys, and kind of sneaking 2 of them in has been a little bit tough this year. So as the value kind of comes up, I think a more balanced approach on tonight's slate is kind of reasonable, makes more sense, where last night it was kind of stars and scrubs trying to fit in Giannis and Cousins. So I think tonight you can kind of go that way. There's a lot of good pivots to be had. Each position really has probably about 3 or 4 elite plays that you can plug in up top. So definitely don't mind spreading some shares, especially if you're building multiple lineups. But let's dive into it here. San Antonio and Orlando. San Antonio obviously in a good spot against an Orlando team that doesn't really play a ton of defense. We can go back to the well here with guys like DeJounte Murray, even coming off of a down game. Obviously, didn't score in that previous game against Miami, but obviously have been very, very solid prior. He's averaging 10, 8, and 4 this year. Going up against the defense of, DJ Augustine and so on there in Orlando, I'm more than fine with using him as a value on tonight's slate. When we start to look at, LaMarcus Aldridge, once again, the usage that he has so far this year, it's on par with some of the other guys that are, elite power forwards in terms of usage. Melo even has a 30% usage this year. Porzingis 32%. But when we look at Aldridge, it's right around 30%, averaging over 1.2 fantasy points per minute this season. Orlando 26 against power forwards. I think you can easily go back to the well. I know Aldridge is expensive, obviously a guy that we don't love paying these types of prices for, but he's consistently going out there and getting it done. He brings that upside to the table as well, being the only guy in that Spurs team. So feel free to really go that route. No one really else on the Spurs side right now. There's not enough production. You can take a shot with Danny Green. I'm never a huge Danny Green fan, but obviously his production's been fairly solid over the last few games. Has that potential, especially if he's getting rebounds, especially if he's getting blocks and steals, to kind of go that route. Probably more of a GPP play for me. I know he scored 30 in each of the first couple of games here outside of against Chicago, but once again, I think the floor is still rather low. There's a couple other options I do rather go with. So on the Orlando side, not a ton of interest for me with some of these guys. The only guy that you could really probably take a look at is Vucevic and GPPs. He's really cheap on DraftKings, 6,900. He's a little bit more expensive on FanDuel, where I don't quite want to pay 87 for 100 in a matchup against the Spurs. 25% usage rate. I think 6,900, it'll get rather lower ownership because it's a matchup with the Spurs. But going up against, Pau Gasol at center, it's not really a tough spot. It's just a slower pace in terms of just going up against San Antonio. So don't mind him in tournaments. That's about it, though. Not really looking to use DJ Augustine in this spot. Murray's a pretty good defender. Guys like Fournier, Gordon have shown pretty decent, but they're a little bit too expensive in this spot. So Houston, Charlotte, this next one here, good spot. Charlotte at home. I like Kemba Walker in this game. Obviously, it wasn't bad last time out against Denver. That game kind of blew out early. They didn't need a ton of production out of him. But Kemba's obviously, mid-priced. He's fairly solid. We know the usage rate's going to be there in this matchup. Not a bad spot for him. 25% usage rate. Houston, middle of the road against point guards tonight. I think you can go well here. Jeremy Lamb, consistent value play. Don't mind going up in this spot. He's still kind of mediocrely priced, coming off a decent game. He's been obviously very solid, filling in for Batum and has been going back to last year. So those are probably the 2 guys that I would really look at. Dwight Howard's not a bad play tonight. Against a Houston team that he's played for before, so I don't mind him in the spot. Once again, he continues to be fairly cheap on DraftKings at 7,100. You get that double bonus. Hope that he can rack up some blocks. He's rebounding a ton this year. He's averaging 18 rebounds per game. He's never going to be a huge scorer. He doesn't need to limit the turnovers. It's killing him a little bit on FanDuel. 7, 2, and 6 over his last 3 games, but decent spot here. Like these Charlotte guys, Frank Kaminsky is a guy that you can take a look at off the bench. Decent GPP play. He's been above 30 in 2 of the last 3 games. If he can get hot from 3, it's obviously a decent spot. But he's actually put up a fairly amount of producing scoring coming off the bench. So I don't mind him at his prices on GPPs. When we look at Houston side of things, I think Clint Capella, tough spot here against Dwight Howard. I don't mind him still because he is fairly cheap, but obviously we know potential upside from him is, basically a huge near 20 rebound game and probably about 15, 16 points. And if you can get the box going again, it's obviously a good spot. Played 32 minutes last time out against Philly. Once again, Montrezl Harrell's still out. At least Tariq Black behind him. Hopefully he gets that run in plus, 28 plus minutes. So still fairly cheap on both sides. I don't mind going back to the Wild there. Not a tremendous spot, given Dwight Howard's against him, but I think Capella's going to be fine. FanDuel price, it did pop up quite a bit, 7,700. There's some other options that you can look at. But I'm not going to roll it out there as well just for that price. It will keep his ownership down still. Eric Gordon continues to be a solid producer off the bench, and just in terms of usage, 32%. I don't mind the spot. Charlotte's a little bit of a slow down pace team, but I think this game is actually going to be decent for fantasy, especially given that we can kind of narrow down where the production comes from. So definitely don't mind going to Eric Gordon coming off the bench. Like I said, 32% usage rate, strong numbers there. Outside of that, Ryan Anderson, Trevor Ariza, if he plays, not really looking to be used in this spot. Denver, Atlanta, definitely a game that probably doesn't draw a ton of interest from the overall crowd on tonight's slate, but it's definitely got some good GPPs. Atlanta's on the back-to-back. That's a little bit of a concern. Denver has been playing slower in pace. Looking at the Denver side here, I mean, it's kind of been just basically a hit-and-miss spot with some of these guys, especially in the backcourt. I mean, I'm more intrigued with Jokic here in the front court and kind of hoping that he gets that upside. Decent spot for him in this spot. Atlanta's not, tremendously great against centers. They're not a good rebounding team as well. So when we look at Jokic, I don't mind using him. Playing right around 33 minutes per game, not bad. As far as the other options, Paul Millsap hasn't showed a ton of upside this season playing in Denver. He does get the game. I don't know how much if you can call it a revenge game. There wasn't a lot of bad blood between Millsap and Atlanta. So, once again, he just hasn't shown the upside since going to Denver like he has in Atlanta. He is starting to get a little bit cheaper. I think you can use him on DraftKings at 6,300. I don't mind that. FanDuel, he's not too bad either. He's 6,600. Decent cash gameplay. You kind of know he's going to go out there and probably get around 30 fantasy points on tonight's slate. Not playing hefty minutes over his last few games, 28, 29, 30. So would like to see that kind of creep up into the 33 range at most, but not a bad spot for him. If you're looking at other Denver options, it's kind of tough. Will Barton's nothing more than a GPP shot off the bench. The back end production from guys like Murray and Harris really haven't been there this season, so there's better options to go with on this slate. When we look at Atlanta, you can definitely go and use Taurean Prince again. Put up a dub last night, but this is a guy who's been producing quite a bit, especially in the defensive, averaging 1.4 steals per game this year. Fairly cheap on both sides. Ken Bazemore is once again the guy that I have quite a bit of interest in just because he picks up a little bit more usage. He's taken a ton of shots, 19 and 17 since Dennis Schroeder has been out. Once again, he's a guy who can notch steals. He's had 3 games where he's had 2 or more steals this season, averaging, 34 fantasy points over the last 2 games with Schroeder out. So, the shot's obviously not efficient. He's shooting about 35% from the field, but the opportunities here, it's not a bad matchup against Denver, so I don't mind going and using Bazemore because it's probably the last game where he's actually going to be somewhat cheap. 22% usage rate over the last 2 games. 55 on FanDuel, we can't really argue against that. Bazemore is kind of one of the guys I'm most intrigued with. In the front court, tough spot. I just don't like targeting Millsap and Jokic. So I'm kind of fading the John Collins, at his price. I think we can look other ways because there's a couple better options, in my opinion, that we can use. So I'm not going to be really looking to go that way. Brooklyn, New York, a battle of 2 bad teams. But Brooklyn, obviously, I think is a lot more fun to use in fantasy. Good spot for him then tonight. D'Angelo Russell is a guy who doubtful for tonight's slate. That kind of opens up the door for a few other guys. We saw Karis LeVert struggle a little bit last game, but has been producing over the last few. Should actually get into the 29, 30, 31-minute range tonight, so I don't mind using him at his cheaper prices. Look at Spencer Dinwiddie. Once again, I think he's going to be an extremely popular play. Come off a 22, 5, and 6 game, gets a spot against the Knicks, who struggle against point guards, who struggle against everything. So I don't mind using those guys. Once again, DeMarre Carroll, it's just been kind of a consistent thing with him to get above 30 fantasy points. I mean, you look at his numbers, they're just hard to get away from him. The price actually on him really hasn't come up. He's averaging 16, 6, and 2 this year with 2 steals per game. I'll continue to lock him in at all formats. Not a bad spot the slate. When you look at Allen Crabbe, probably more of a GPP play. I prefer the other 3 more than I do on Brooklyn's side. Crabbe's a decent guy, 4,900 on DK, once again in GPPs, but that's about it. Hard to really trust him elsewhere. Reasonable usage rate off the bench, around 18%. It's not tremendous, but I don't hate it. When you look at the front court, Rondé Hollis-Jefferson, tough spot here, tough spot for these guys. I'm kind of more off of them and more on some other options. You can look at Trevor Booker if you want off the bench, but he's kind of getting a little bit expensive for my taste. So on the New York side, it's kind of just a two-man show at this point for who I'm going with. Kristaps Porzingis, obviously a top-end talent on this slate. You look at his price, kind of came down a little bit from where he was. It dropped a couple hundred. He's 85 on DraftKings, 89 on FanDuel. He leads power forwards in usage rate on tonight's slate. Obviously, Brooklyn 29th against power forwards. Definitely a guy with a ton of upside. Once again, the price is very high. Coming off a game where he was expected to produce and didn't. But I mean, coming off prior 30-point games in the first 2 games of the season, I think we can look at Porzingis in his spot against Brooklyn. So love him tonight. And this Cantor's a guy that you can really look at as a bargain center. Coming off it and rebounding a ton. 16 and 19 game against Boston, 17 and 10 against Detroit. Brooklyn, obviously not a good rebounding team. Cantor's a guy with some decent usage, 23.5%. So I like going to the well here with Cantor. Cheap guy. You get a decent floor out of him at this rate, given the fact that New York's is kind of committed to using him in this type of role. Sure, they sacrifice some defense, but it's hard really not to use Cantor at these prices. So I'll continue to look at him. I mean, $6K on FanDuel, $5,900 on DK, really nice prices if you don't want to quite pay up all the way. So outside of that, I know Sessions is fairly cheap. I don't mind using him. Not playing a ton of huge minutes. Obviously it did blow out the last few games outside of Detroit. Should probably be around 25, 30 fantasy points. Decent spot against Brooklyn. So you could definitely do worse. He's only 4,400. I'm not going to knock the play there, but that's about it. I mean, Tim Hardaway Jr. really hasn't looked great. He continues to be just basically a stab in the dark if you want to play and hope that the shot starts to fall, because shooting, less than 25% of the season, you're kind of just rolling the dice every time you're playing him at this point. So OKC, Minnesota, next one here. Obviously, when we look at the top-end talent of OKC side, you have your Russell Westbrook that I think you can look at, who's, obviously a little bit cheaper than last year. And kind of when things come down to, I mean, still in your 30% usage rate, 11.5 on FanDuel, 11.4. We were kind of paying the 12, 13K range for Westbrook last year. And, the same type of player hasn't really, disappeared. We've still seen the big upside come off last game. He's got some shooters around him, especially if George and Mel can get their shots in. So I like Westbrook once again tonight. I think if you're making him a priority over Harden, I don't think that's a bad idea to get him in. I don't think the other options are bad either. When you look at Paul George, obviously coming off of one of his worst games of the season, fouled out. Just didn't look really all there. I don't know what was up, but obviously fine the first few games, especially with his defensive numbers. He has 10 steals on the season already. Put up a big game against OKC last time out, 14, 6, and 8 with 4 steals. So decent spot. Jimmy Butler's supposed to be back tonight. Slate, obviously that helps Minnesota defensively, but they really haven't been that great defensively this season. So I don't mind going that way. Carmelo's just still going to be probably a GPP play at this point. I can see him kind of flirting in the mid-30s on this slate, which I feel like I can get a little bit elsewhere at his price. Don't hate the move. These guys are still getting up a ton of shots. It's basically one of the reasons why we don't look at anyone else on this team. Steven Adams, once again, you can take a look at in this spot. Big game against Minnesota last time out. He's been pretty strong that you can continue to use. Getting a lot of rebounds. I mean, averaging 13 and 8 this year, 1.8 blocks per game. So Adams continually is a guy that you can use for a cheap center. I mean, him and Cantor, I think, are the guys now right in that mid-range where if you want to load up elsewhere, pay down at center, because Karl Anthony in a tough spot against OKC, Vucevic in a tough spot against San Antonio. Jokic obviously pricey and hasn't shown all that much upside. So, you can pay down this mid-range and feel pretty good about it. On the Minnesota side, Karl Anthony Towns, just a GPP play at this point. I'm going to pay down in the other range for cash games. Hasn't shown the hugest upside in the world in terms of the ceiling, but decent spot for him here. When you look at Wiggins, obviously nailed OKC with that buzzer beater. Once again, I mean, you look at Wiggins and what he's done this year, it's been pretty phenomenal. Kind of from what I didn't expect coming into the year. He's playing heavy minutes. We know that what we're going to get with Tibbs. Shooting really well, starting to pick up on some rebounds. He's shooting 48% from the field, averaging 25 and 2 this year with a steal per game. So I don't mind him in the slate if you want some exposure on the Minnesota side. It's not my favorite spot to target, but I think, you can look at some of these main guys. The one guy that I am off of is Butler. Still questionable for tonight's slate. Tough spot for him. I just think at his price tag, it's hard to get a lot of upside out of him right now, especially given the fact that he was never really a tremendous shooter. And now that we kind of get some other guys cutting into his usage rate, it's a little bit tough. So I'm off. You can look at Jeff Teague once again here tonight, coming off a decent game. He'd probably be the secondary guys I'd use off of Wiggins and Towns. So Teague's a pretty cheap play and not a bad spot against Russell Westbrook, who's not all that great on defense. So I'm okay there. And if Butler does sit for some reason, I'm not really on the Shabazz train. Yes, he's cheap. Tough spot against Roberson, Paul George. So I'll fade there. Moving on, we got Toronto and LA. Good spot here for really both sides. I don't mind the Lakers side. They're going to keep games close this year. I know Toronto's a better defensive team. We'll start with this Toronto side where, Kyle Lowry still pretty cheap on both sides. I don't mind the matchup. Finally kind of broke out a little bit against against Golden State. 7,600 on DK. I think it's a reasonable price. He's 75 on FanDuel. Probably going to get a good 30-point floor out of him. Hasn't really been shooting all that well this year. I think when the shot starts to drop, things are going to be okay because the assists and rebounds are still there. Would like to see him get a couple of blocks first or a couple more steals per game. That's something that heightened Lowry's floor over the last few years. So don't mind him at his price. He's playable in all formats for me. When you look at DeRozan, once again, a guy that I struggle to play on a nightly basis at his price tags, but I don't mind the upside, obviously, in this spot. KCP's a decent defender, but DeRozan obviously going to handle a lot of the usage, so I'm okay with it. 28% usage rate this season. He's averaging right around 40 points per game, so definitely going to be looking to go to him. In terms of the front court, I mean, Serge Ibaka, fairly cheap. We haven't seen a huge upside game out of him. He's been right around 20, 25 fantasy points per game this year. But obviously a good spot against our Lakers front court. Jonas Valanciunas is still ruled out. Lucas Noriega is a guy that's questionable. So we get Jakob Poeltl, a guy that I don't mind on this slate. He's obviously produced in huge minutes this season, or when given the minutes. 24, 27 minutes over the last 2 games. He's double-doubled. 7 blocks in each of the last 3 games. 7 blocks over the last 3 games. He has a steal in each of the last 4. So come up in price a little bit, but I think we got to obviously look at him in this spot. 5,400 on FanDuel, 53 on DK. Decent play in all formats for me. So I like him. I like Ibaka. You can take a shot on Power, CJ Miles, I think at GPPs, but I'm going to go other directions in cash games. On the Lakers side, it's kind of tough with this front core of using like Nance. We kind of get these random big games out of both these guys. He still only played 24 minutes. And then obviously you have Kyle Kuzma there as well, who they're splitting time with, who played 33 minutes. Kuzma's still my guy that I rather take because the minutes have been there over the last few games. 34, 30, 28, so good spot for him at cheaper price tags. When you look at the guards, Kyle Lowry, usually a guy that I like to pick on, but I don't mind Lonzo Ball and GPPs tonight. Obviously, even when he doesn't shoot well, we know the production's going to be there. He's shot under 25% the last 3 games, has put up over 30 fantasy points. So I'm okay with him. Once again, he's not terribly expensive, so I'm okay if you're targeting that late game. KCP is a guy that you can look at. DeMar DeRozan's, once again, not a guy that I love to pick on, but Caldwell Pope in the spot, once again, he's just too cheap. He's playing huge minutes. Is a guy who's going to get you a steal or two a game, rebounds, and rebounds pretty well with his body. So I'm okay with using him. Pretty much off everyone else. Clarkson, I'll fade on this slate. He is getting a decent amount of usage off the bench, but I think we see the minutes kind of cut down a little bit for him. So off that train, Brandon Ingram, a little bit of a tough spot, but I don't mind him in GPPs tonight. So moving on, last game of the night, Washington Golden State. This is going to be a fun one. Obviously, I think there's a lot of stars to be had in this one. We look at the Washington side. Obviously, John Wall's hasn't really been great this year, like in terms of getting the huge upside. Had the game against Detroit, obviously against Philly was pretty solid. Struggled against Denver a little bit for what I was expecting out of him in that matchup. Struggled against LA. Obviously, a spot against Golden State where I think, we look at the totals of this one. I mean, 110 110 for Washington, 121 for Golden State. They're expecting an 11-point spread, 231 total. It's the highest in the night. Wall's obviously in the spot here. Curry's not a bad defender. But I like Wall if you are paying up for a point guard. I mean, I think he's a good pivot off of Westbrook, who people will probably just go to Westbrook. I think people obviously use Curry tonight too because you kind of get a little bit of a discount on him. Beal in a tough spot. Thompson's not a bad lengthy defender. I think you can use that backcourt, obviously, in GPPs. I think there's a little bit safer routes in cash games at their price tags. When you look at some of the other options like Oubre and Porter, Porter's still fairly cheap on DraftKings. It's not a huge discount like it was the other night, 5,900, but 67 is decent. He's playing a pretty big role, especially defensively with a couple steals per game this year. He's rebounding really well, so I don't mind going to him. Oubre, a little bit tough to use on tonight's slate, but I don't mind him in GPPs. Gortat's interesting. He's a guy who should be able to stay in this game. He's pretty cheap. Coming off a double-double game. Nobody really off the bench worth using for Washington. They should play heavy minutes tonight as far as the starters go. So once again, I don't mind any 5 of those. I think they're tremendous GPP plays tonight. I think you can get a reasonable floor out of them for some of them in cash games like Gortat, but I like those other 2 centers a little bit more. Beal, I don't mind in this spot. Wall, I don't mind in this spot. Likely, you don't need me to really tell you that. So obviously, solid plays all around. Look at the Golden State side. Draymond Green probably chalks out as my favorite option here. This is a game where he can generate some blocks and steals. Obviously, not a huge usage rate, right around 1 fantasy points per minute this season, but decent spot here. 8,200 on FanDuel, 74 on DK. This is a spot where I can obviously kind of lock and load him if I don't want to pay up for some of those other guys like Porzingis or like Aldridge. So he offers a slight discount. Kevin Durant's probably the main guy that I'm looking to use here. Washington against wings has just not really been that great over the last few seasons. We know Durant's usage rate right around 28%. He's been excellent so far this season, averaging 25, 7, and 6, 3 blocks per game. So I'm going to continue to kind of lock him in, especially on DK. 9,400, you're getting a really nice discount. He's 10-1 over on FanDuel. Obviously a little bit pricey, but worth it, especially if those blocks continue in that scoring. So like Durant quite a bit. Thompson, Curry, probably just GPP plays for me tonight. Once again, you can continue to play Curry at shooting guard over on DraftKings. Once again, that's about it for me. There's no Sean Livingston tonight. Curry may play a couple extra minutes, but you're probably going to get some of those backup guys in there who really aren't worth much on this slate. So that's going to wrap it up for me. You can head over to fantasycafe.com, check out our great tools and content.